Hello, this is David Morales, CEO and founding developer of Wiese. Welcome to season 2. We're bringing the video component back in. We had some success with the educational sessions at NODAC and AHEP. Our purpose is the same, building better pathways for student and supporter success. Our topic, this is like Pandora's box. We're about to do it. We'll focus on students who do not fit the mold of the normal college student. Our guest, the more than famous, the infamous Dennis Wiese. Good morning, Dennis.
Good morning, David. How are you?
So, Dennis, we're going to start different. Why are we focusing on these types of students in today's interview?
Oh my gosh, there's so many reasons. I think I'll start with because they deserve it. I think if you look at the history of higher education.
Well, who are they? Let's explain who this non-traditional or what
Sure.
are we talking about?
All right. So if you go to non-traditional, the textbook definition is anyone over the age of 24 or is not a first time in college or transfer student. So you're talking about adult students, you're talking about students with children, you're talking about student veterans, you're talking about maybe students from other countries other than the U.S. So again, anyone that doesn't kind of fit that stereotypical mold of an 18 to 24-year-old just graduated from high school kind of student.
Okay, and why is it important?
I'll go back to because they deserve it. I think if we'll go back to even your question of we as a country, if you will, or as a profession, have this stereotype of what a college student is, and we design all of the programs, we design all the services, and all the things that we talk about are this kind of stereotypical student. But our students are complicated, and our students are much more than that, and our students that we can serve and should serve and do serve are much more complicated than that. But we've built this process by which we think of our students as kind of this homogeneous population that looks like a certain thing. And so I think that they deserve it. Now, we can get into the broader, right? We can get into the enrollment cliff. All right. So enrollment cliff is coming. Everyone knows it's coming. It's going to come in 2024, 2026, depending upon where you are. But the enrollment cliff is for 18-year-old high school seniors. Okay. So there's still millions of people without college degrees that don't fit that box. And so we think about it from that perspective as well. So again, beyond just the fact that they deserve it, if we think about it from just a purely economic perspective, if you wish, there's a massive population of our country that doesn't fit into that box that can help make that differential between, again, your 18-year-old first time in college student and what you want your enrollment to be at your institution.
Well, you talked about this box, right? And we got to define that box. Today got very interesting. I got a whole bunch of questions from previous people who've done podcasts with, also someone else who's not. I also have a book that we're going to talk about today, The Great Upheaval. It's aligned with the conversation that we're having, and you know that I don't even count the books I've read now since February 8th. It's way above 50. And I'm tired. I read this last book. I couldn't even finish it, but I did. But the relevancy, I think what we're talking about, and I want to be clear, is, people are almost afraid to say the word pandemic anymore. It's like, oh yeah, it's so overused. Right. I'm using it in a way that it accelerated a problem that was already there beforehand, and you nailed it. An economic thing, a change, a shift, whether it's a drop off or not, the whole world has changed with technology, and that's one of the things we're bringing to the table. Right. So that is the topic, right? But let's get back to the general of your interests and things like that. I want to learn more about you, sure. But I kind of want to dive in of how you got into the position that you're at now so that the audience can hear it. Because when we get to these hot topics, man, I'm ready to go.
So I've been at UNC Charlotte almost 15 years. Before this, I was at Clemson University. Before that, I was at Illinois State. So I'm originally from Illinois, did my undergrad and master's at Illinois State. But I did not do my master's in higher education. I did my master's in history. And so I come to higher education initially from a very different perspective than some of my colleagues at the time, because of my history background, but also just my interest. I come to this from the why perspective. Why are things the way they are? Why are systems built the way that they are? Why is the process that we have the way that it is? But I've always been in OTR. I've always been in some component of that field. My specialization, if you will, has always been in really student affairs and academic affairs partnerships. So if you look at the career path that I've had, a majority of my work has been in trying to find ways to build onboarding processes or integration processes that marry the student affairs experience with the academic affairs experience, and making sure that we think about the student in a holistic capacity. And so much more of my time here and much more of my time at Clemson, was spent with academic partners more than student affairs colleagues. So career path has been, very much about this holistic student experience and really thinking about what it really means to be a student and how can we build processes and build systems that can help students be successful.
Okay, well, the path here is always very interesting, but why are even people going to listen to us? And let's get back to a little bit of the roots of our relationship.
Sure.
When Dennis and I met, it was a long time ago through the NOTA community. And as the years have progressed, we've shared insights back and forth. We embarked on season 1. This is season 2. Season 1 was an experiment. It was to see how can we start getting the voices of Visual Zen's clients, VZ's clients, in an impactful way. And it's really hard for people to say, I'm going to listen to one of 1 billion podcasts out there. Well, why is it even relevant to me? I'm going to tell you why it's relevant. The reason why is these people are very smart. Most of them have PhDs or are on their way to getting them. Most of them have been around for 20 years and understand what the heck's going on, but there's no platform to share their ideas. So we made up one called VZ Topics. Didn't know where we're going. So Dennis, thank you. We had some crazy ideas on what we wanted to do. We took kind of my version of heuristic, kind of like little birds flying where they need to go and navigating, even though we have the magnetic stuff in our eyes telling us we need to go this way first. That the series of podcast interviews we did was to gain insight, like the people behind me, of understanding key topics, orientation leaders, supporters, but really what you had said earlier, I mean, really with a vision of creating a seamless onboarding process. It's so pivotal. It's so important that there's so many things going on that no one knows what they're doing. And part of that NOTA community when I met you, Dennis, and I know we joke around the ties, the VZ tie, your tie, we switched them and everything like that. But I want you to tell, why do you think people need to be listening to us? What did we accomplish in season 1? And I'll talk about what we're doing in season 2 in a bit.
Yeah, I think you can hit on it. You brought to light voices in a way that people were comfortable with. I think if you look at, we'll just take NOTA, for example. I've been an associate editor on the NOTA Journal for 5 or more years. I was the chair of the research committee for NOTA for 5 or more years. Have always been a part of kind of that knowledge group within the NOTA community, informal type of place. And we always knew that there were people that had amazing ideas and amazing insights and fantastic thoughts. But there really wasn't an avenue other than, okay, they can do a presentation at NOTAC. But if they weren't really willing or able to put that down on paper, right? So they weren't submitting articles to the journal, or they weren't submitting papers to the research committee, things of that nature for grants or other. There really was no other way of getting that out of people. And NOTAC is a once a year thing. And, sometimes you miss a presentation. Sometimes you miss that opportunity to hear that amazing insight. And so I think one of the things that has come from this format is the ability through technology to be able to get that out of folks in a very comfortable conversational way, but also to have that live in, the digital world. And so people can go back to it, they can pass it along, they can take the insights that they've learned and say, hey, go listen to Dwayne and listen at, minute 14, he says something absolutely amazing, or go listen to Christopher and, his whole thing is, great. We should make sure pay attention. I mean, so I think it's just, again, giving folks that platform to interact with their colleagues that are both doing amazing work, but also really offering some cool insights into what we can do and should be doing within the new student onboarding space.
Yeah, well, as you know, for those other podcasts, sometimes I've dug into their dissertations, and I'm not digging in yours. But what I am want to dig in is, you said NOTA, you said NODAC being the conference, but NOTA also provides resources and information that people do. And you guys provided a presentation a while back, you and Emily Wheeler. And I think that is a foundation of what I want to talk about today. But I feel like if we skip this piece, people are like, well, what the heck is David talking about? So just like I dug into, even Dr. Ryan Newton's and Katie Murray's and everyone else, what I'd done, I want to dig into this a bit. So if you can give a brief understanding of, I believe it was called a theoretical grounding for OTR practice, dynamic three-part heuristic.
Yeah. So Emily and I had been for a number of years working at UNC Charlotte on how do we become, again, back to this concept of systems. How do we look at a systematic onboarding for our students here? And in doing that, we realized that there's a much larger, I use the word heuristic. I'm going to use it interchangeably with theoretical because it's just comfortable. But, the difference between a heuristic and a theory, heuristic is a shortcut. It's a way of thinking about things, but it's not necessarily a theory. A theory has typically some sort of experimental foundation. It has some rationale. So that's the differentiation between the two. But we realized that there was a model, if you will, out there that would help to explain the process for students, regardless of institution type, regardless of institution selectivity, because it's really grounded in the human experience, and it's really grounded in cultural acquisition. It's grounded in the transition process for any human being really going into any new culture, any new environment. And we also knew just from our time that the concept of what orientation does, like what do we do in an orientation, transition, retention? What are we talking about? What is it actually accomplishing? It never really been documented. And so we also wanted to kind of look back at the literature, both within higher education, but also outside of higher education, and say, what is the theoretical underpinning for the work that we do within OTR? And put that into something that a practitioner could utilize. Again, we don't want this to be super theoretical. And then we had an opportunity with one of the NOTA publications to turn that into a book chapter and really try to provide a systematic process and understanding for those on the practitioner side, and then also be able to turn that into, it literally can be turned into a worksheet. We've got a work, now it's massive. It's an 11 by 17 worksheet that any campus can utilize to say, during this transition process, how do we make sure that our students are getting what they need when they need it, so that they can be successful once they are enrolled in our institutions. And so the heuristic really kind of follows a three-part component. So it's a prepare, a process, and a perform. How do we want people to think about things? What do we want them to feel about things? And what are the things we need them to do? And if you look at, the CAS standards, if you will, on orientation, there's a lot of great stuff in there, but it's very performative. It's the stuff we need them to do. And I think a lot of times as orientation leaders were asked, and the focus is on making sure that they, get registered for classes, or make sure they get their paperwork done, or make sure that they, do these very specific things. And that's the tangible outcome, which is important, which is great, but that's not all that we do within the OTR world. And I think it also was Emily and I trying to kind of point out to folks saying, there's so much more that we do, and then there's so much more that we can do if we think about the student in a holistic framework. And really that comes down to how do we want to see themselves, and how do we want them to think about themselves, and how do we want them to think about the institution, and then also what are the things we need them to do. And so the heuristic is really an integration of that, and it's also periodized. We don't need them to do all three of those things in equal balance at every single moment of their onboarding process. There's a periodization to that. Some things are more important sometimes than at other times. And so it's also providing a framework for folks to kind of be able to design those systems and say, all right, at this point in time, what's really, really important is getting them to see themselves as a student, to see themselves as a member of our community. And so we're going to prioritize that over, okay, later we may need to make sure that they're doing paperwork, make sure that they're filling out contracts, make sure that they're registering for classes, and we'll do that at a later period of time. But again, those are not equally weighted in all time periods within the onboarding process for our students. So again, part of what we were trying to accomplish is giving some structure for that dialogue to be had on campus, but also for people to really design and build systems around that onboarding experience.
Well, you said theoretical, and this is, a concept, and this helps people, I would assume, build programs, right? Or how to at least embark on the decision-making process. Now, why everyone's wondering, why is David even here? I mean, like, you're just interviewing these people. You don't bring anything to the table. You're worthless. But what we do bring to the table is the technology component. And people forget, because of the large volume of clients in the years we've been around, we've seen these programs constantly change. That means our product has had to change to all the different applications of a theory. There's some schools that are heavily academic advising based. Others are supporter based. Some are pure military or first gen. Sure. It's incredible, the variances. And we'll get back to the topic of non-traditional students, that concept,
Sure.
The mold or whatever, because it's not the mold they don't fit. It's actually the mold that fits. And we'll talk about that percentage I told you earlier, about like 64%. That's more than just a mold that doesn't fit. That's the mold. Right. And if we don't pay attention on how that mold got created, which we will talk about in a bit, we'll launch it with this book. And I said before, I didn't say the name. It's The Great Upheaval. People can probably visually see it. Arthur Levine and Scott Van Pelt. But what we bring to the table is also a joint passion and a joint interest, I think Dennis and I have. That is looking at, we take it from the systems lens, technology, because that's what we build. You take it from potentially the theoretical and in practice, and merging it together for the common purpose. It's really building a better pathway for these students. And then what we realized through people listening is Dennis and I talking, it's layered. It's not just students, it's supporters. And what the hell does a supporter mean? And the reason I bring that up, and I'll bring up Ryan Newton. So Dr. Ryan Newton, episode 8, he's a director of first-year experience at the University of Central Florida. Just the other day, I kid you not, they actually met all their people together and say, oh, we need to define our supporters at our school, and we need to define and tailor our programs to meet their needs. And he actually said this, why and how, like you said earlier, intentionality. Thank you, Chris Johnson. Why and how those roles differ by student type. So if the student type now is a mold that's not meant to be fit in, now it's the big mold, we need to address that student type. And that's why I think today we're recording this so people can listen. It is so imperative that we understand the new role of these people and these new student types, because it's multi-layered. You're not just catering to the student who has a parent, you're catering to a supporter that could be a veteran that has a spouse. And because those spouses come more frequently, male or female, come more frequently than parents do, shouldn't we be paying attention to the supporters of a 64% mold? I think, and that's a number I'm throwing from the book. So if anyone wants to call me out on that, you can call the data on their part. I just like to read and I regurgitate. But you see where I'm going with this, Dennis, right? So I'm trying to get your foundation for this work that you did with Emily, and more than that, your practical experience in getting into it. But one of the things I don't want to lose sight of is your interest and your passion. I still don't understand, and I've known you for a long time. Why is onboarding so important to you?
So, first-gen student, I'm the fifth of six to go to college, but I was the first to move into a residence hall. I was the first to experience that kind of collegiate component. I also was a transfer student, so I have an associate's degree. I can remember those parts of my higher ed experience where, you have that question of, do I belong? Should I be here? Why am I here? What am I doing? What's going on? But also I had this weird, as a transfer student, my undergraduate institution did not have an orientation program. And so my first experience in orientation was when I was working in orientation. So there's a personal component to me for this of, okay, that would have been helpful, for me to have had as a student. But I also think there's so much growth potential for higher education. And I think there's so much opportunity for us in OTR to provide leadership in this as well. Because I think we've done tremendous work on the academic affairs side and tremendous work on the student affairs side, and really trying to do some deep reflection on what is it our campuses are trying to do and accomplish, and what are we wanting to be. But a lot of institutions don't really give much thought to, how does a student feel like they belong? How does a student really go from being not a student to a student? What's that process look like? How do we facilitate that? And then, to your point, how do we do that for their supporters as well? How do we have them envision that experience as well. And so there's a personal component of it, but then there's also just this opportunity that I think that, some institutions, especially highly selective institutions, students, institutions that have, tremendous affinity, have figured this out by accident. So I mentioned I was at Clemson University, and one of the things that drew me to Clemson University was it has an amazing school spirit, has an amazing sense of what it means to be a Clemson student. And there are students, babies go home from the hospital in Clemson year. That's the level of, buy-in that people have. And so when a student is admitted or even applies to be a Clemson student, they already are seeing themselves as a student. They already see themselves in that space. They see themselves as belonging. They see themselves as wanting to be a part of that community. And there are many, many institutions that have that, but there are literally thousands of institutions that don't. And so you can take this kind of elite few that just happens. But
you nailed it, by the way. I was going to bring that up. You stole it.
Quite honestly, the rest of it. So again, Illinois State was not that kind of institution. Mm-hmm. UNC Charlotte's developed to be that way, but definitely was not that way when I got here 15 years ago. And so seeing that level of buy-in and seeing those students who will do everything they possibly can to stay as a student because that's part of their identity, that to me also kind of sparked an interest of there's something to this, and there's something to this process. The other piece, again, I come from a fraternity background. I was a fraternity member as an undergrad, still active within my fraternity. And with anything, any organization, doesn't have to be any organization where there's an induction process, right? You go from not being something to being something. It could be a Mason, could be any organization that you can imagine where you go from not being to being. There's a process that occurs with that. And so those are things that are meant to be transformative. They're meant to be to help someone create a new identity. So again, that influenced my interest in this and my passion around this onboarding process.
Cool. Well, a couple things. Technology mindset, me. What we're really talking about, the scope of why we have VZ topics is onboarding for higher education, specifically this part of the student life cycle that we're calling the part of the pathway, but the real pathway that takes this huge bucket of people, like the funnel of prospects, and really sticks them to an entry point. Jose Villar did a separate interview, which we just posted on Vimeo, where he said, the reason we used VZ's task list, that's technology, right? Task list was the funnel to get one point of entry, one point of area, technology-wise, to then send people in the correct paths. And it was a great way of engagement. But when does that start and when does that end with our technology? Even though we do online applications and all that, the scope has to be set with onboarding. So in our world, it is really the post-admission pre-orientation. You'll laugh because this is the worksheet from his seminar that he did. But I laugh because our task list never existed first. It started with the middle piece that says orientation. And we grew from orientation to this post-admission pre-orientation. And we grew it out to the post-orientation pre-academic. I never knew these words, Dennis, because when we first met at UNC, it was just you wanted a reservation system. And we kind of poked these things back and forth.
Right.
But the same ideology was coming out of just an idea and then technology molded together. So the scope of what we're going to be talking with non-traditional students is a pathway, really from how they need to be treated. And we're going to get into niche populations too. And that is a burning seed of why we're around 21 years is because we always dealt with niche populations, even on the orientation level, getting the right student group. But now we're expanding that niche population to pathways. So part of the presentation you gave and the paper you wrote, paper chapter you wrote and such, is can you briefly explain maybe, probably, I'm going to just go there as long as you want. Take the word briefly out. I'll interrupt just in case. Of what your version of this what I'm looking at here, basically.
Yeah. So again, it comes back to this concept of periodization and make sure I'm going the right direction that you're looking for. So in the progression from a potential prospect student to really, again, if you look at the literature, the first 6 weeks of any academic term, there's a process that a student's going to go through. And there's a parallel process that a supporter will go through as well. And so what Emily and I kind of broke them down into some discrete chunks, but they can be broken down depending upon your institution in any way that makes sense. But we broke it down into, a pre-orientation experience, so a post-admission pre-orientation experience, an orientation experience, a post-orientation pre-academic term, that first component of an academic term, and you could extend that out into the full academic year if you wish, or the semester, however you want to break that out. And because those are really the pivotal points. Those are, to some extent, the decision point for a student. So they've been admitted. Do they accept that admission and attend orientation? Okay, they've attended orientation. Do they go ahead and matriculate in the fall and show up in the fall term? They've showed up in the fall term. Do they stick around through those first 6 weeks and then to the end of the semester? And then if you break that out and say, okay, they've stayed to the end of the semester, will they re-enroll for their sophomore year and do that? And so there's some kind of logical progressions in that experience. But also, to some extent, it follows the NOTA definition. If you look at the NOTA definition on orientation, transition, retention, that kind of follows their definition as well of what that looks like. But again, those are the kind of the decision points. Those are the break points. And those are also the places where, to kind of tie this back into both, the technology piece, but also the populations pieces, those are also the times where things are different for different kinds of students. So again, an 18-year-old coming out of high school who gets admitted to one institution, two institutions, three, whatever that number is, they may still be deciding what school they want to go to when they go to orientation. That orientation experience builds something on that. They may go to multiple orientation experiences and then they move on. Again, you take a non-traditional student, be that a student veteran, be that a student with a child, be that an adult student.
I'm going to throw out a statistic.
Yeah.
Even moms, there's a statistic on the number of moms that are non-traditional that have children who are going to work. Anyway, I had to throw that in there because I think we need a hero to a story. I think moms are heroes. So
absolutely, and you look at those schools that have done great work in those areas. Schools that have done good work in non-traditional, what have they done? They've either provided, access to on-site childcare. They provided courses outside of a traditional, quote unquote, traditional college classroom time. So something outside of the 8 to 5 type of framework. They provided courses on the weekends. They provided courses that are directly applicable to whatever the work experience is. But even that process for that, pick that student, there's still a point where that person had to apply, had to get admitted, and had to decide that this was worth their time, money, and investment. And as OCHR professionals, as higher ed in general, we have a direct impact on what that process looks like. We can put up all kinds of barriers to that. We can make it really, really hard. We can make it, really complicated on how they do that. Or we can leverage our technology, we can leverage our resources and make that an easy, smooth, seamless experience. One of the things that specifically for-profit online institutions have done exceptionally well, and, yes, they have a bad rap and there's all kinds of, but what they did was provide easy access higher education and allow people to see themselves as a college student that would not have traditionally fit into what the college student was. Okay. And so I think when we think about that from an organizational perspective, that's kind of where we're driving. So again, coming back to the work that Emily and I did, it's really taking this concept of what's the truly cognitive human neural formation as it relates to identity development, as it relates to engagement and acculturation. How does that occur? And how do we then leverage that process effectively in higher education versus just being the institution's like, oh, well, they'll figure it out. If they want to be here, then they'll figure it out.
Yeah. Well, that's a hot thing because the person that has a question today is doing exactly what you're saying with online. And we'll talk about that in a moment. I will lock into that, I promise. Yeah. I want to go back just a step. The reason I wanted to define, you're saying you're not sure where I was going with this. Yeah. The onboarding process has a third variable that most people don't have. The only reason our task list is taken off and very effective is because time. I'm a math guy, physics guy. Time is a variable. It's a calendar view of series of steps over a series of time. A lot of people have a checklist. These are just things you do procedurally. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just do whenever you want. That's not engagement anymore. That engagement needs to be derived as a pathway. And so when I was trying to explain path to people, people forgot time. And that was why we couldn't explain it to people. And then we said, look, orientation, when I showed that, the little checkbox or matrix you had, it was just a blip of time.
Right.
We took that time and made it 12 months.
Right.
That engagement path is critical. So we'll get back to that. That's the mindset and the construct that when we bring this back in.
The other thing with checklists, the other thing real quick with that is, again, it's back to this concept of periodization. Because of the way people think about tasks, et cetera, those tasks need to be of criticality at that moment. So they need to be timed to what's going on. And so there could be, again, 10 things that a student needs to do before they enroll in the first academic term. All 10 of them don't need to be done at the first second. Don't tell them that they need to do step 10 until they need to do step 10, because A, it looks silly. People think, why are you telling me about applying for graduation when I haven't even, signed up for my first class? Some students will be interested in that. Sure, make that information available, but there's an event horizon. There's a horizon of time that is critical for decisions. And so this really comes up, and I think when you really get down to, as a former OTR, frontline putting together an orientation program, and everyone's like, oh, this should be an orientation. Oh, this should be an orientation. That's a sophomore year conversation. That's not an orientation conversation. At this point in time, they're just trying to figure out where the dining hall is. They're not worried about what their junior year requirements are at this moment. Are there some that maybe? Sure. But they're just trying to figure out who's going to be their friend. So let's think about this from an event horizon perspective versus let's tell them everything all at once so that we never have to tell them again. And then later on, when they don't know something, we can tell them, well, we told you that in orientation. Yes, orientation was 4 years ago. They forgot about that. I'm sorry. It was 4 weeks ago. And I think I had a breakthrough with a colleague here one time when, we really broke it down to the human experience for someone taking a new job at a new city. When you take a new job at a new city, you don't just show up on the first day of work and hope that you figure it out. You've done all kinds of research. There's a process. Can I live there? Is this a place where I want to go? How do I find a place to live? What are the restaurants I'm going to like? You do that in that space as well. And so it's mirroring that experience for our students is really when we start talking about that timeline that you're talking about, that periodization, is very comparable to someone taking a job in a new city. How do you do that?
Yeah. So this is my new metaphor, so I'm working with it. So we're trying to do the 30,000 foot view. And by the way, my brother is the one correcting me. He's a pilot for American Airlines, captain. He's like, I hate it when people say 20,000 feet. It's 30,000. Just say 30,000. So I say 30,000 feet. I was like, what about a helicopter? He laughs. He's like, that's way lower. I was like, so I have 3 layers to my metaphor. We have the airplane 30,000 foot view. We have our helicopter, and then in the weeds. I think everyone understands now as we progress through here, and they probably know already, but we've just said words and terms and understanding that was just a 30,000 foot view. I want to get down to the helicopter layer before we get into really non-traditional students, and we're getting close. It's the pathway concept of each pathway is a definition, a classification, maybe even a nomenclature when used to put things in a bucket or something defining. But all these different buckets and these niche populations need to have some variability to it because it's so different every year. Things change. And so talking about time in the pathway, each one of those steps are engagement. And it's ironic. Look, I have papers all around me of questions. The majority of them, if you filter them out, they're questions about how do we engage at the right time and what do we do? But these people are asking different times. So it's a different step of one of them. I'll start with LaShawn Tiller from Spelman College. She's not a client. I speak to a lot of people, and Spelman College is a very powerful school. Small, but powerful. Yeah. And they had an initiative to go online, like you were talking about, to go national and get a lot of new things going on. But their target is this non-traditional student, adult learning. And she was funny. She was like, oh, you're going to speak to Dennis? Could you ask him this? And you don't have to answer it now because I think it may come up later, but this is a relevant of an instance of what you were just talking about. Is she said, for those non-traditional students who would like to fully engage and have the time, do you offer appropriate extracurricular spaces? that is contradictory to what I'm about to read in the book of what they're talking about what non-traditional students want. And that's the adaptability that I was trying to explain to her. I was like, you could be right. They may want those spaces. But a lot of the time, I won't even say it. I want to read it. Do you mind if I read it real quick?
Go for it. It's your podcast. I'm just here hanging out.
Okay. Well, you're going to have to maintain me. Otherwise, I can talk for hours and then the editors will not like this. So dealing with these segments of population, single moms, seniors, returning students, institutions attempt to keep their feet in both camps. What that really means and what I've read from the book is as we are catering to the 18 and 24, we have to cater to these other groups, non-traditional. But if you go to non-traditional, there are even some more subsets, more niche populations going on. And this is about, and we got time here, so I'm going to take my time. In the book, I'm going to read directly. These students seeking the same kind of relationship with their colleges that they have with their banks, supermarkets, and internet providers. They ask the same four things of each: convenience, service, a quality of product, and low cost. With regard to college, what they are looking for is a convenient location, parking near classrooms, and courses offered at a convenient time. So you have LaShawn looking at a model saying, hey, what can we offer them for a sense of belonging, all of this? You have another group of people who are really concerned that if a class is at 11:30, I can't make it because I have to work, I'm going to drop out and not go to that school. So how do you cater to that process? So the reason I brought that up to you is explore your mindset and now get into almost to the weeds. We're rappelling now down like a Navy SEAL or something. And we're just going there. Talk a little more now about the non-traditional student, with veteran, being a mom, and you talk about economics. Yeah. And how did we come to this? And then I will share a couple of thoughts I have on that too.
Yes. So this is I don't want to say this is tough because it is really getting at the heart of what is higher education about. And again, I'm a history geek. I'll go back to, we have to remember, higher education pre-World War II, pre-GI Bill was not about a meritocracy, right? It was not about who was smart enough to get in. It was who had the affluence enough to get in. So it was not about making the space open and available for a single parent. It was not about making it open and available for a non-traditional student. It was, how do we create a learning environment that perpetuates the status of the elite? And how do we make sure that those cohorts of elite continue to meet and engage and perpetuate their power dynamic within the structure? GI Bill comes on in World War II. Suddenly we have this literally millions of predominantly men, but men and women who now have access to higher education. UNC Charlotte's actually an outgrowth of that. We were formed in 1946 to serve World War II veterans. We had 176 original students who are all World War II veterans. That's our foundation here. That's when higher education really had to start thinking about what are we really providing. But then you had the baby boom. And so you had more people than you really knew what to do with. And so you don't really have to answer that question if you've got more people beating on your door and everybody wants a college education. And so this, I don't want to say it's a new question because it's been around for a long time, but it's coming to the fore in a way that it never has before, because I think, we've just become better human beings and more aware of the diversity within the population of our country. But there is an economic component of this as well. How do we continue to have the enrollment growth that we're wanting, or how do we continue to have the enrollments that we want? So, you're asking these questions of, why do classes happen between 8 and 5? Well, if you look at most college campuses, they don't happen between 8 and 5 because, just like anybody else, myself included, faculty don't want to teach at 8 o'clock in the morning any more than I want to show up at 8 o'clock in the morning. So on our campus, our sweet spot is like 9 to 3, 9 to 4. That's when, if you look at our course availability, it is maximum. When you get to that non-traditional student, be it an adult learner, someone who is, working full-time, part-time, things of that nature, that's where that barrier comes in. How do we rectify that? How do we remedy that? First off, you've got to determine, does your institution care? And that's a really harsh statement to make. But if your institution doesn't truly care, then you're not going to do anything. You don't need to do anything. If you're meeting your enrollment numbers.
But they shouldn't care. I'm about to read you a quote from the book. It'll be my last one. The balancing act for the university to make that decision is often too much to manage. The 6-year completion rate for students who enroll at age 24 or older is 48%, compared to 64% for traditional students. So it seems to me that this percentage is growing a bit. I mean, it's becoming more relevant because it seems like all the non-traditional stuff has to be online schools, maybe community colleges, all these different placement things. But the attention, the focus really needs to be more on these types of people and their enrollment rates. And it's almost these schools, that's the balancing act of, it's not no longer which one do we pay more attention to. It's holy crap, we got to pay more attention to all of it.
And what's interesting, the conversations that I've been in and the work that I've done, what's fascinating is when you think about serving, again, quote unquote, non-traditional students, what do we need to do in order to support them? And how do we build an environment that is welcoming and affirming and a comfortable space for them? What's shocking is that you look at it and go, wow, that would work really well for our traditional students as well. It's kind of by taking the lens and moving it out of what we've always done or what's traditionally been done for the 18 to 24-year-old and really sit down and come back to what are the first principles? What are the things we're really trying to accomplish and make sure we provide those for, again, everything from transfer students to student veterans working, whatever it is. Shockingly, it's like, oh, they need, as you said, they need convenience of courses. They need courses, not just any course. They need to have progression courses offered at times that are available to them. They need to have a clear pathway. There needs to be a logical progression from day one of coursework to graduation. And it needs to be done in a way that they can actually manage and comprehend. And if you ask that of, okay, well, how do we do that for non-traditional students? Shockingly, that's like, oh, well, maybe we should really look at how we do that for our traditional undergraduate students as well, because it probably would make their lives easier too.
Yeah, well, Christopher Johnson, who did episode 4, Director of New Student Family Engagement at Cal State LA, he has a couple questions that's aligned here. And so I would like to ask you, because I could pretend to answer it, and it's probably not the same as in your brain. But I'll start simple and get more detailed.
Sure.
What outward-facing language are you using to describe these populations? Internally, we understand what non-traditional means, but when we define people by what they are not, we run the risk of alienating them.
Yeah, and as usual, Christopher hit it perfectly. I think I'll come back to, it's not about naming, again, and he said it himself. The moment you start putting somebody in a box, there are restrictions around that box. Be that an adult student. Okay, well, an adult student automatically puts them in a box that says they don't have time, they don't have interest, they're going to be very transactional, they really don't want to be a member of the community, they're here to get a degree so they can go get a better job. Sure, maybe, but not all of them. But you know what they are? There's someone who wants to be educated. There's someone who wants to feel like they're valued as a human being. There's someone who wants to feel like they belong. They feel like their time spent on that campus engaged in that work is a valuable use of their time. And so, I don't know that I have the amazing insight answer of, what's the language that we use. But I think for me, it's what are we really trying to communicate about what it means to be a student? And again, coming back to the sense of how do we as an institution communicate to our students and their supporters what it means to be a member of this community? What does it mean to be a part of a higher education space? And communicating that through the actual voices of the individuals who are in that space. And so rather than, me as an administrator or, a traditional age student talking about we're veteran friendly or we're adult friendly. Well, why are we not having adult students do that? Why are we not doing, 10-second vignettes of adult students talking about, yeah, it was really awkward to walk in the first day of class and see that I'm probably the oldest person in this space, or it was really awkward to walk in and be older than the professor. but here's how I made it through that, and that's okay. And here's what I've gained from that experience. And letting individuals tell their stories. Let people tell their story, not try to manipulate.
Don't get Dr. D on this one about telling stories. We'll be put to shame.
It's true. Let the people who have that lived experience talk about that lived experience rather than me trying to develop a marketing plan that utilizes new and cutting edge language to try to. Can I be effective at that? Sure. Is the likelihood of that happening low? Exceptionally low. I would much rather connect that student with a peer, connect that student with an office, that is geared to, a non-traditional population, and let someone who's lived that experience talk about the pros and cons of that. Be like, wow, there were some days where it was horrible. And there are other days where it's like, wow, I really felt like I was getting something out of it.
No, I agree. And in my head, whenever I think of the word office, I think of trouble. Sorry. Like back in school. I want to challenge us with a little thought process. It is a branch of conversation, so I'll have to pull us back. We talked about orientation leaders. We spent a lot of time last season doing that, and mainly talking about incoming and the customer service model, how they start, as a freshman and go along. What you said was something critical, that it's not that we missed, but didn't have time to address. Sure. Some of those mentors or peer mentors, like you said, and orientation leaders should be advocates for certain groups, because I can tell you as an adult being 45, if I were going to go do my PhD or whatever, I don't want to sit in an orientation group of 18-year-olds and their parents. Right. I want to be with the like-minded people, my sense of belonging and such. Sure. That even includes that when you're onboarding people from the military into the normal workforce, they're different. So they need to have a coffee date with someone who's been in the industry, have that mentor that you're talking, that coach to do that. Dr. Katie Murray from Towson University, episode 6, and these are not shameless plugs. These are continuations of real conversations that have occurred. She wanted us, and this relates to Ms. Tiller from Spelman that I had brought up earlier. How do you recognize and affirm the differences in populations in orientation and transition programs while integrating these students into the larger campus community? So you're not just saying you're popping in for a class or not. How do you get them into that culture?
Well, and you just talked about orientation leaders, and so we'll kind of use that as a good avenue for this. I think you do it a couple of different ways, and I think the campuses that have been successful doing this have done it in a number of ways. One, if all of your marketing material talks about, we are adult student friendly and we are student veteran friendly, and every orientation person you run into, every orientation leader you run into is a traditional aged, 22-year-old sophomore, junior, or senior, there's no continuity of that narrative, and people automatically, maybe even just subconsciously, become pretty, all right, are they really serious about this or are they not? I think the opportunity and where some of the institutions have been really moving, and I think is exceptionally successful, is establishing those peer relationships. And again, for the peer population. So student veterans is a part of my portfolio at UNC Charlotte, has been for any number of years. One of the things that we've always had just an informal environment for, but now we're formalizing, is that peer-to-peer communication. It's critical for that population. I think, again, if you look at the literature, the programs, and historically the programs, especially at predominantly white institutions that have been supporting non-white students in that population, or non-white students as incoming with mentoring programs, have historically been very successful, because, again, it's finding that individual that has a similar identity and can speak to you about their experience. And so it's a continuity of messaging, one, but it's also providing access from a new student or a student who's being a part of the onboarding process with an existing student, and not having it be this like super scripted, everything was wonderful and everyone loved me. No, that's not reality. There has to be this authentic, if you look at even Carol DeWick's work on the growth mindset, there's got to be this opportunity for people to talk about, it was hard and I failed, and here's how I grew from that, and here's how I became a better student here, and here's where I found my place, and here's where I found my community, and here's how I found that space. It's facilitating that process more than trying to, make sure that our publications have, XYZ component, visibly in that. Because I think we all, have seen those publications where it shows faculty members teaching outside in the beautiful quad, and then you go on that campus and no one ever does that because it's 105 degrees and they're not going to do that.
Correct. Well, much to talk about that, because if I go back to Ms. Tiller from Spelman, I'm going to read exactly what she said again.
Yeah.
But I want you to hear one of her examples she cited. As you being part of fraternity, she asked something specific about that. And I would hope to get your lens. It doesn't have to be an answer. It could just be, this is what I think, because she's building this from scratch. Yeah. And she's leaning on other people who have insights, and she just wants some direction. So the question is, for those non-traditional students who would like to fully engage and have the time. So you're talking about those non-traditional, that's the label for now, the box that we're not supposed to be putting them in, but just that. Do you offer appropriate extracurricular spaces like clubs and Greek life?
Is that should you, or is that how do you do that? What's their question?
It was, do you offer them appropriate ones? So, because I think she's trying to gauge, is this a good tactic for them to begin with to do it?
So I would say absolutely, but I think the question I think that then come back to the campus is, what does that have to look like? And I think one of the things that we learned, through the last 2 years is that human interaction can look different ways for different people, and also I think if you start talking about adult students with clubs and organizations, again, our default is, we're going to have, a meeting at 9:00 at night on a Wednesday in our student union. Okay, that may or may not work for an adult student. That might be great. That may work great because they're, they have a child and that child's gone to bed and their significant other can, or that may not be remotely plausible. But why could you not have that same meeting at a different time, completely off campus at another location that might be more convenient? Or can that meeting be virtual? Can that meeting be done in a way that it's completely different than kind of the traditional structure? When you get to Greek life and fraternities and sororities, some of the organizations have become more open and accepting of that than others have. I think if we look on my campus, we have a number of very traditional fraternities and sororities that a non-traditional student would I think have some difficulty becoming a part of. We have other organizations that would be very open and welcoming of them. I think it varies by organization, but it's coming back and asking the question of, what does student involvement and student engagement look like? And does the institution have to control all of the variables? Does it have to be held on university property? Does it have to be led by a faculty or staff member? Does it have to look a certain way? Or is it, an online group that gets together and, maybe it's nothing more than it's following someone on Instagram, or it's a old school Facebook group that people just support each other in, but there's an opportunity for that to happen in a equally non-traditional way. But we can't just assume that there's some magical time and magical day that we could pick as an institution and say, this is when adult students can come and do this.
And I don't think it should. Back to Greek life, back to orientation leaders, tying them and bringing it to this conversation. One of the things I've learned by being on campus in multiple universities, not just, I always talk to UConn, but there's some great schools I visited, one of them, Tennessee Tech. And I got to meet a fraternity there. And what they do is they get their fraternity brothers to become orientation leaders to recruit people. I think giving access to Greek life or clubs or those people to these niche populations for advocates, just like you would do for veterans to have, the peer mentors, possibly finding a couple people that, who are alumni of these, Greek life, to maybe assimilate them or do something. It was just something that was on the top of my head. It's like, this becomes down to back to the onboarding process of what, go ahead.
Right. So I'm going to bring it back to, the BZ product, because I think this is where path from Viese becomes a critical component because it's that personalization. One of the things that we've been kind of hinting about but haven't really named in our conversation today is, what I'm really advocating for is the personalization of the onboarding experience and the personalization of that process, even at institutions that are as large as UNC Charlotte. We're almost 30,000 students. When you think about specifically, the kind of stereotypical small private liberal arts school, and you talk to students, again, the traditional kind of response is, I wanted someone to know my name. I wanted someone to know who I was. I wanted to feel like I was a part of a smaller community. You look at that in higher education, again, large publics, embedded learning communities. Why? Because they're recreating that small liberal arts experience. If you look at even honors programs and honors colleges, what are they doing? They're recreating a small, intimate experience. And so if there's a way to do that from a technology perspective, because again, and you've referenced this from the book, people want that experience like they have in their retail life. One of the things, I was an early adopter of Amazon. Why? Because I loved that it recommended new books for me. I thought that was cool. I'm like, wow, it can actually give me things that I'm interested in. What we haven't done in higher education is to say, what do our students need? And know that that's going to be personalized. And then develop tools and techniques that personalize doesn't mean that they're not getting the information. They're just getting it in a way that is fitting their timeline, but also fits some other characteristics that we may know about them. And so if you think about the Viese path, or you think about the onboarding process, and if I come in as an adult student, I come in, I'm a 30-year-old single parent working full time, and my path has just naturally built into that how to navigate the university as an adult student. It may not be called that, but that's what. If that's kind of just presented to me as a part of the process, I'm just going to assume that's the part of the process.
Right.
Where if I'm a 18-year-old just graduated from high school and it's like, finding your place at the university as a new student, it's the same information, but it's presented in a way that actually then resonates and makes sense to them. But if I'm, again, a 30-year-old person coming in, don't talk to me about, oh, here's what it's going to be like to live in a residence hall, and here's what it's going to be like to find your first friend on campus. Don't talk to me like that. That's not, you've already lost me. You already have told me that I don't belong on your campus.
Correct.
And so that personalization, it happens in technology. Again, TikTok is fantastic because it personalizes. The algorithm works. Why are we not taking that same mindset and bringing it to higher education and the onboarding?
Well, hold on. We are. It happened this year.
I know.
Yeah.
But again, that's the power, I think, of the Viese path, is that a student, if we know that if the demographics are there, and we have, as an institution, said, the path is a little different for this bucket of students, and it's a seamless, they don't have to self-identify, they don't feel awkward clicking here, clicking there, and then saying, please give me the non-traditional version of this. It just is there.
Yeah.
Then that student automatically is hearing things that make them feel like they're a part. Again, if we come back to this heuristic, that identity development process begins at the moment they're like, wow, they know exactly what I need. They know exactly what I'm feeling. They know exactly the questions that I have. Wow, this is great. And even if they missed, even if we only get 75% of the way there, okay, great.
And that's a better margin than zero. I take that any day.
Absolutely.
And I don't bet. It's funny we talk about the path. I want to explain to the listeners what that really means from a tech point of view. What we've done for 21 years is data analysis and get these trigger points. And actually, I believe I remember it was Anaheim or San Diego. You and I were sitting at a NOTA conference long ago. This is like 2008 or whatever. You're like, hey, David, I think that you track all this stuff. You're doing niche populations for event management, meaning if they're a freshman, transfer, what college, what major, are they athletes, honors, these buckets that you were just talking about. You're able to isolate all that to make it more peer connected back then. How about if you expanded that and just had those analysis points? And that's when Pathways came about, is that each of the steps on that calendar, if you remember time, expanded out, allowed that unique traversing point. Right. But why I'm bringing this up, though, and I keep shaking my fingers, someone's going to say, you can't do that anymore. I have to use two fingers. I don't know if I'm even allowed to do that. Probably means something in some space. But content delivery. What Viese has developed is a content platform of saying, hey, we can tell you where they are in these steps. We could tell you the type of student, and this is for a year. Why can't you deliver the right content, like what you were talking about? Why can't we get as granular as saying, this is a 32-year-old, whatever, mom.
Right.
There's a mother's group on Facebook that we endorse, the school endorses.
Right.
Maybe you want to have the peer network developed there. Or go so as far as these are I'm just saying what you said, but I can say for myself too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It could also be books. It could be anything that is a suggestion point, but that content's owned by the university, not by the platform. And that is what has been amazing. So this content platform is staged over a series of time. And I want to talk to you about that because, as I'm looking at the different needs that happen, there are a lot of people who write books. And I did Marjorie Savage, episode 3, You're on Your Own. And a couple of the people I've met, Chelsea, I believe, from AHEP, they got these great books to help parents, to help supporters, not just students get to where they're going. What's your thought on content delivery? And this is the crystal ball question, is in a platform that can allow for these granular niche population pathways for a series of time, how do you see the future shaping around that?
So I'll go with the time component first. I mean, again, if you come back to the heuristic and these kind of periodization process, I think one of the things, at least on my campus, and I've seen it others and talking with others, is, we've got a huge missed opportunity that, again, if we take a traditional summer orientation kind of program coming into a fall term, students experience this amazing, on-campus experience, whatever that orientation experience is, and then nothing happens. There's no additional follow-up. There's no continued process of onboarding that can happen at some institutions. And so there's a tremendous potential there as well to really talk about, okay, you've done this. Here's the next step. Here's what to start thinking about. Here's what it means to be a part of this. Here, again, using your example earlier, if you're a non-traditional student, here are student organizations. Here are, clubs. Here are meetups. Here are things that we have, on campus that, are there and built in to help with that. But that's also an opportunity for the supporter component as well. If there is a parallel process for supporters. There's a parallel process where, they have, some family members may have amazing excitement about their student applying to a higher education. Some may not. My wife talks about, her dad was not super supportive of her going to college. She did it anyway. She had other supporters in her life that were very supportive of that. I was fortunate to come from a background where, neither of my parents went to college, but that was a given. We were just going. That's going to happen. But there was never a conversation with my family members about what it meant to be a supporter of me going through the process. And so when I started to struggle academically and I started to struggle even transition-wise, my parents had no frame of reference. They didn't know what resources were available. And so when we really think about the supporter component of this, especially we start looking at the research on Gen Z, not that Gen Z are drastically different than millennials or Gen X when it comes to the family engagement component. Families have been increasing in engagement since I was an orientation leader years ago. But really, that's that process of acculturation, right? If you don't tell a family member or you don't help a family member find their identity with your institution, they're going to find their own. One of the things that we find from cultural work, Edgar Sheehan's work on cultural transmission is if you don't purposely do that, it's going to happen informally. And so what I would advocate for is that you've got to have a formalized process. Even if it's only 50% effective, you at least have kind of said, here's what a supporter for our campus looks like, and here are your touch points. Here's your opportunity to engage with leaders. Here's your opportunity to engage. But then also, here's what your student's going through. And then that has to be periodized as well. Here's what your student's going through, post-orientation. Here's what they're going through in their first few weeks. Here are the things that they're experiencing. First tests happen, typically 3 to 4 weeks in. It's a high stress area. Here are the things. So really viewing, student supporters as what they've always been in that student's life, which is by definition a supporter, and viewing them as that versus we've got to keep, you're a bulldozer or you're a helicopter or you're someone who is a limitation to the student success. supporters are not a limitation to student success. Supporters are an asset to student success. Supporters not given an opportunity to engage with an institution effectively can be problematic, but they're not a limitation to students.
You know what really frustrates me, and I feel like I can't say Peter Griffin or a Family Guy, or probably not, but really grinds my gears. I said it, so I'll own it. That everyone talks about helicopter parents. That annoys me so much because when they start overusing that term, they don't know what a supporter is. And if you go back to why we're doing this podcast about non-traditional students, we're talking about wives, husbands, people on the same, they sleep in the same bed together. They eat breakfast together. They're not parents. They're not kicking their kids out. These are life partners. So why would you treat them as anything other than what they are?
And then again, just to pure economic terms, it's if the family member or supporter has a financial relationship with their student, right? They're providing whatever financial support that is. Doesn't have to be paying full tuition, because any financial support is going to be a drain on the home finances. Mm-hmm. That's an investment. They have a true financial interest in what's going on, and for an institution to say, don't worry about it, we got this. Really? I'm giving my student, $5 a week, $500 a week, $50,000 in tuition, and you're telling me don't worry about it? That doesn't make a lot of sense. When, as you said, they can be tremendous advocates. So when that student is, really thinking about, okay, do I belong here? I'm really struggling in classes. I really don't know if I want to be here. And that supporter can have access to resources and say, you're really struggling. Don't forget there's a tutoring center. Don't forget that there's an RA. Don't forget that there's, your professors can help. Don't forget. Or the student's like, I'm not sure I want to go back. Okay, why don't you want to go back? Is it because it's not a good fit, which happens, and it's just not the right place? Or is it that, you feel like you are in some way don't belong there? Okay, what's that look like? And so again, the supporters are a critical component of this. And are there these outliers that, of course there are, because human beings are human beings. There's always going to be outliers that create difficulties, but the vast majority, and parent and family programs have been part of my portfolio for years, and I've worked with them at other institutions. A vast majority of them just want to be a part. And in some places, especially if they don't have an affinity to their collegiate or don't have they want to be like, give me the gear, send me the stuff, give me, tell me what to buy, tell me what the brand is, tell me, how do you essentially almost treat them like a student, give them a way for them to engage and have their own space and experience to do that?
Well, we'll stay on the topic of supporters, because what Dr. Ryan Newton, I said earlier, alluded to, and I'm going to say specifically, when they met with their team, they had to define supporters. But it was funny what you talked about earlier. I'm going to bring it up in relevancy. One of his questions, which you kind of answered, was how are we telling the story about supporters helping students to succeed?
Yeah.
And if we don't define what a supporter is, how can you tell a story to a parent that really belongs to a spouse or belong to someone on the same, as you said, financial, all those components? And that's a critical question. Yeah. And one of the things that we talked about, the pathways of the student, Wiese also offers pathways for supporters. That means that supporter, whoever they are, be a spouse, a parent, a coach, a mentor of some sort, they will have their path bound to the student. So when we know the niche population of the student, let's say it's a veteran or a mom of this, again, we're focusing on non-traditional students per se on this conversation here, right. Then we know the task list for that supporter, time-driven, right. Can also be tailored and content-driven. Right. Not just for the student to get content, the supporter to get unique content and how to support their spouse per se in doing that. I think that's opening Pandora's. No, that's not even that. Not even not Pandora. Forget that. This is a reality check that we've raised a glass ceiling on how to deliver content now to a different subset of audiences. Now we're starting not to define them per se as boxes with restrictions, but define them as being. They need to be treated special. Identity. It's important.
Yeah, it's just that mindset of versus, adversaries versus, they're not, don't create an adversarial relationship. it's a cooperative relationship. We're trying to find a way to make it cooperative, and the more you can make it cooperative, the better the experience is going to be for all involved.
Yeah. So you ready for my insane? It's not a segue, I know, but this is for the people listening here. It's the beginning of season 2, and we're going to have a whole bunch of other episodes coming about. But this is a topic that Dennis and I have been talking about, and I found a way to string this together to today's conversation. It's, if we look at, and Dennis, you have to correct me if I say this wrong, but that pre-orientation, post-admission orientation world, right? That segment of time that's dependent. We're going to talk about advising. And we found out recently that a component of our software that we do pre-advising, which is in that world, was really being harnessed, the data, not harnessed, harvested, the data to begin determining sizes of classes and the teachers. But I'm going to lean back on the topic, and then we're going to go straight into this. This is what Christopher Johnson said out of Cal State LA. He's like, what services can your campus offer to these groups? What's a generic question? But you know him. There's like 8 paragraphs after this one. But one of the things is like, folks who are working need accesses to courses taught at convenient times. So if you knew your student population was non-traditional, you pre-advised them correctly during the onboarding process. You knew they were only available from 5 to 7 o'clock in the morning or in the afternoon at night. You can make more convenient times, back to that fact that I said from the book, which is down here. That's why I'm pointing like this. So I'm not used to the video component. I'm getting used to it. The book of saying that if this population is growing, we got to pay attention to the data. The data needs to start shaping. I think you call it ERP, resource planning and enterprise resource planning and stuff like that. Tell me your thoughts.
One of the things that, especially at growing institutions, or again, any institution that's trying to meet student needs, is information. And if you look at, even some of the external companies that do research on this kind of thing, the resource allocation becomes a giant black hole, because especially for incoming new students, we have a very large transfer population at UNC Charlotte. It's very difficult for us to sometimes do course projection because we have so many transfer students. So the ability to have insight into what course needs are not only can help students who are in a non-traditional space or need space outside of that, again, 8 to 4 p.m., 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. timeframe, but also, are trying to just get course progression, things of that nature. You can essentially start becoming responsive to what, for lack of a better way of describing it, your customer needs, or you can really look at, what are the needs of an institution. But it also gives you an opportunity to look at, what does latent demand look like? So if you always know that you have more students that want to enroll than can enroll, is that an opportunity to grow and develop and evolve? It helps you understand what majors are popular or what classes are popular. That pre-advising module, and really that understanding of what courses students are interested in and or are wanting to enroll in, has financial implications, it has staffing implications, but also student satisfaction implications as well. I mean, if you are an incoming new student and you're really, really excited and you register for 15 hours of classes and you really only wanted one of those classes, then that's going to be a problem. You're going to end up with a student that doesn't really feel like they belong because there were no courses available for them and there was no opportunity for them to be a part of the collegiate experience that they were looking to have.
And that's what, there's so many things that frustrate me, only because I want to make them better. If I didn't care, I'd be like, whatever. What frustrates me about content delivery, and I'll wrap it back to advising, content delivery now has become of selling an experience, but not delivering an experience. The pre-advising or pre-orientation, if you use what we call the engagement path at VZ, is not just content delivery, which is very important. Trust me, you got to have videos, you got to sell, but you also got to deliver through engagement, filling out forms, filling out information, using that data to make smarter decisions by OLs, orientation leaders, by advisors, by directors, by chancellors, by the CIO, which is my world now of dealing with those people. They're brilliant. And I'm going to do whatever. That's a whole nother thing that I'd like to do as an episode. But what I'm trying to say is it's not just even a hybrid. It's multidimensional approach to engagement that requires the content delivery to be correct and unique to the audience. The engagement of looking at advising properly of, making sure, as you said, the customer service.
Right.
People care. If we go back to that model of like what I want from my bank, what I want from this, what they're really saying is I want a high level of customer service and performance. And you can't do that by making a video of kids, screaming and yelling at a football game and all three generations wearing Clemson sweatshirt. That's a portion of it. Don't get me wrong. That is necessary for part of the process, but the process that people are throwing at content is like, oh, just get this video and then click a couple quizzes and tutorials, and that's all you need for orientation. No, you need the whole gambit of attacking to prevent poaching, to prevent these things, and that's what we talked about previously. As my Napoleon Dynamite phrase goes, I love technology. Whatever happened, we're stitching this back in. We finished, I think, with me saying poaching, and I'm not going to even cut that out. We'll just continue the conversation. But the engagement path for supporters are critical along with the students. So therefore, that we can eliminate some barriers. And one of them is getting the right content. One of them is getting data being collected. So you can reduce that melt and such and higher yield for retention. Because I think that's one thing we didn't talk about is how key is why we're doing all of this is to make sure that the sense of belonging is met, all those things that we're trying to drive at really deeply to make sure they go to the institution and carry it on even further. So that supporter platform with the task list, we have learned, that's why I brought the word poaching, and for people who are not very familiar with that, is really other universities taking students away through marketing and such. But you know what we also learned? It was the reverse. That consumer-based mindset of people wanting to shop for different colleges, guess what they were doing? They were doing orientation at 3 different universities at the same time. And we actually found by their email addresses, people using our same system and doing that. So we found a trend. That's all we're saying. And that's the power of using a company that has, a lot of, customers so we can do the analysis point and everything. Right. But, wrapping this whole conversation, we are getting to the tail end here, which is actually quite appropriate that happened. So this population of non-traditional students, if we go back to the beginning on, I think the question is why we're focusing on it. Let's look into a crystal ball. So we just talked about why we need to focus on it today. We gave some facts, we gave some numbers, things that we need to be doing, and what can actually be used to get done. Right. How do you see the next 2-3 years shaping these student types, and how do you see them being part of this larger community, as Katie Murray said? Like, what's going to happen?
I think the institutions are going to be successful, meaning that they're going to be able to maintain enrollments. They're going to be able to continue to serve their populations, whether that be a state population, regional population, community population, whatever that is, are the institutions that are looking at their systems and trying to find those barriers to access and trying to find those barriers to progression. And those are also, there's also that opportunity to leverage those technology tools. And, again, we were just talking about pre-advising. What does pre-advising also do? Especially if it allows students to either completely register for courses or at least talk about courses that they're interested in taking. Again, there's a cognitive component that happens when you commit to something. When you say, these are the classes I'm interested in doing, you click a button saying, I'm interested in enrolling, or I'm going to enroll in these courses, it creates an affinity for that. It creates a sense of identity with that organization and institution. And so when we look at the crystal ball, it's those organizations that have really reflected and looking at those systematic biases that happen, but also have built tools that nudge people along. That nudge them forward, that have defaults that are providing opportunities for people to continue to see themselves as a progression of that, they're progressing at that institution. And so, the crystal ball, that the institutions that are going to be successful are the ones that really are looking at, again, I'll come back to the statement, they're looking at first principles. What's it mean to be a student here? What's it mean to be an individual? What does it mean to be successful? How do we get someone from the point of interest to the point of graduation in a way that is seamless, that makes sense, that engages them, that engages their supporters, and does that in a cost-effective way, if you will, or does that in a fashion that at least seems as worth the investment in that. But the technology tools are there. Again, we've been talking about the Wiese platform. The technology tools are there, that it's not just these individual touch points. It's not just the admissions counselor. It's not just the orientation experience. It's the complete process. It's this complete transition process that occurs. But it also is then that student life cycle. How do we then help students identify what graduation looks like? And how do we, the federal government accepts a 6-year graduation rate. Should we, as higher education, accept a 6-year graduation rate? Should we accept a 5-year graduation rate? Is a 4-year? What does that number look like? But to say our 6-year graduation rate is, 60%, okay. But why is it taking 6 years? Why is that okay? Especially when you start talking about non-traditional students or students that may have financial limitations. Is it taking them 6 years because we've created barriers that prevent them from graduating in 4? Okay, then what's the cost of additional attendance? What's the cost of lost wages? Anything that's now happened because it's taking them 6 years. So again, the crystal ball is really, in my mind, asking those questions and then trying to be responsive as institutions and knowing that we're not going to be able to solve everything. We can't completely redesign higher education in a year or 2 years. 5 years, probably not completely redesign, but certainly make a significant impact. 10 years, we better be making significant changes in 10 years. We just can't stand still.
Well, hopefully, I have another pandemic. As I said in the beginning, it was an accelerator of a problem, exacerbated a lot of different things, but also accelerated almost too much online stuff. We realized how bad I say how bad, it was good, but also bad. And the ramifications of that over a series of time are going to showcase that. Well, one of the things that Christopher Johnson brought up about the crystal ball in the future is what are you promising or selling to these new types of students? Because in my mind, the mindset's already changed. Because I remember back in the day, there were movies. Like I saw movies of people going to college. There were songs written about going to college. But now you see sitcoms like Modern Family and other things talking about online learning. Older people going back to school because they lost their job. Or they want to change jobs. That's another thing. So it seems like the economy has driven the mindset to be different. So what are we promising or selling now to the student type?
Yeah, I think it's as with all things in life, it varies by the individual. There always has been, there always will be a population of students that want that as stereotypical of a collegiate experience as they possibly can get. They want to move into a residence hall. They want to, join organizations. If they want, they may want to join a fraternity or sorority. They want to have the TV show, the movie experience of college. And that's a significant population. And quite honestly, higher education, especially over the last, 50 years, has done a great job of providing that to that population. And we've built, entire institutions around that.
Yep.
That's not going away. That's just not. I think I can remember back when online education became a thing and everyone's like, oh, brick and mortar is going to go away and no one's going to go to class. Humans are still humans. They like interacting with people. They like, and there will still be a population that wants that collegiate experience. There's a growing population, and will be a growing population, that they want the educational experience. They want to leave an institution feeling like they learned something. People don't want to invest thousands of dollars and end a semester with all A's and not feel like they learned something. Does it help them get the piece of paper? Sure. Does it make them feel like they got good investment for their money? No. They want to be challenged. They want to have that educational experience, but that educational experience is going to look very different for them. It may be a little more transactional, but even within that transactional experience, there's still an opportunity for them to feel like they have an identity at the institution that they're at. There's still that possibility. And so I think it's really looking at higher education and saying, okay, we've got a bucket of students that, fit that traditional mold, but we have a larger bucket of students that don't fit that mold, but still want to be proud of the work that they've done here, still want to be proud of graduating from here, still want to buy the sweatshirt with the institution name on it. They still want to have that diploma hanging on the wall and be proud of it. How do we make sure that the population is getting what they need in order to be successful at our schools?
Well, I think the theme I talked about through all the questions of everybody I'm using my right hand now, so not my left. I'll do that. Okay, whatever. The theme being really, the larger community, right? What does a community offer? And in my mind, it offers a lot, but one of the things it offers is networking. Right. And one of the things Christopher Johnson said, I want to read it verbatim, so I'm not paraphrasing, I'm quoting, so I know the legal difference now. Higher ed isn't really in the position to promise people jobs. However, if you can sell the idea of building a strong network, that is something a university can promise and is actually economy proof. Yes. Thoughts?
I mean, so I'll go back to the previous comment I made about, the origins of higher education within, North America, specifically, the United States. It was a way for elite individuals to come together. Part of when they talk about elite business schools, it's not that the education is drastically different than your average business school. It's the students sitting next to you and their connections and the network that you develop there. It's as much about the future CEO sitting next to you as it is about the economics professor at the front of the class. So again, if you look, they're using the same books. The curriculum is not drastically different between the elite and very good business schools. It's the cohort that differentiates them. It's the connections. It's the network that differentiates them. And so, I will say, as an addition to Christopher's statement, we can't promise jobs, but we can promise an education. And I think that's the one thing that we can promise, that students will know more, learn how to think differently as a part of being a member of our institutions. And that is something we can't guarantee, because if we're not doing that, then we're not even meeting the basic mission of our institutions. We're not even getting that far. And that in and of itself is, economic proof, recession proof, whatever. The networks, the building of collaborative structures, but then also how we learn as human beings to interact in those spaces, and how we learn to develop, peer groups and things of that nature is also something that a brick and mortar institution will always have more than an online or even a self-directed learning space that someone might be able to do in a virtual environment.
Well, I think the direct response, to Ms. Tiller and even Ryan and everything like that is, once you understand the audience, figure out how to build a network of that support, that peer-to-peer that you talked about. I think that's critical. So people walking away from today, I would encourage you to focus on that identity, that sense of belonging. Those are terms that have been around for a while, but that's how society works. If we look at the mindset, and I'm going to speak for myself now, that's all I've been doing. And whether I use the word verbatim or not correctly, paraphrase correctly, I don't care. How I feel very strongly is that when you have a problem, you have to look at your support system. And if your support system is one built of strong connections, that's very beneficial. If you don't have strong connections, and that's why I brought up Ryan Blair, a long time ago, nothing to lose, everything to gain. He was a gangbanger. So he was only around gang members. So he's the fifth person. He's going to become a gangbanger, which he did. But once his network changed and people changed, and not just about him, but from my experience and such, my life changed once I built my network correctly. And understanding that sense of community, I think, is going to be key of indoctrinating people through that onboarding process. And this goes back to the onboarding process of, if people stage it, plan it, do it in a correct way, deliver content correctly, engagement correctly, and leverage technology, I think there's some really hot things to get going here. I want to turn that corner now. We're getting to the end because this is open season now. So everyone listening, Dennis and I will be picking you guys out who needs to be talking once we release this. But we encourage anybody who's listening right now, we need your voice. You need to tell us what you think. Your insight, which is different than these two. I call myself old. He's young. We need some fresh insight. So please, reach out and do that. So Dennis, in good fashion of that one thing, this is your last voice. I'm going to shut the hell up, and here you go.
The theme today has really been about the systematic onboarding process. And I think for me, that's the critical growth opportunity for higher education. Because if we focus on that periodized, systematic onboarding and apply that to all of the different types of students that come to our campuses, it will guide us to providing an experience for them that will set them up to be successful when they enroll at our institutions and then eventually graduate from our institutions as well. And so I just really encourage individuals to think about the process, not just the touch points, not just the singular experience and not just the one-time interaction, but the entire process from pre-admission to admission to orientation to that time period in between, the first time of that academic experience, to think about that in a systematic way and to think about that in a human way and to think about what their experience they would want that to have, to think about how that would look different for different populations, but at the same point in time, it's still a human experience. The acculturation process is a human experience. It's a human process. So let's come back to those foundations and know that it's going to look different for different individuals, but everybody wants to feel like they have a way to get from point A to point B, and that those barriers have been reduced as much as possible or eliminated completely in order to make that successful. So again, as we kind of come out of this and we think about what are lessons learned from pandemic, what are lessons learned as we continue to think about non-traditional populations within higher education, or just want to be better institutions, I think one of the critical components of that is just being cognizant of that process and making sure that we are as intentional in that as we can be, and that we can make that as successful for our students as we possibly can. And also provide that opportunity for supporters to engage similarly as well, because I think that's the other component of this that sometimes gets forgotten, is we forget about there's a whole support network for these students, and we have to engage them and allow them to be a part of that transition experience too.